Mr. Thompson here. We're looking at U.S. History Standard 10, identify the legal, political, and social dimensions of Reconstruction. In particular, we're looking at Part C of that standard, describe the significance of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are collectively referred to as the Reconstruction Amendments. They effectively ended slavery, extended citizenship, and gave the right to vote to former male slaves. These amendments are significant because they establish a federal mandate concerning the end of slavery in the United States. Even with these amendments to the Constitution, many southern states passed black codes or Jim Crow laws that restricted the rights of blacks and denied them true equality. The 13th Amendment was adopted in 1865 and is very direct concerning the end of slavery in the United States. The language of the amendment is very specific to ending any existence of slavery in the United States unless it is part of a punishment of a crime. Because the amendment ended slavery, it made null, so canceled out, any provisions for slavery within the original Constitution. The overturned policies included the Fugitive Slave Clause, which required people to return runaway slaves back to their owners, and the Three-Fifths Compromise, which concerned the state's population, so counting 3/5 of a slave toward a state's population in their representation in Congress. The 14th Amendment was adopted in 1868 and is a little more complex than the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery. There are two main provisions in the amendment. First, it declares that all people born or naturalized in the United States are U.S. citizens. As a Reconstruction Amendment, this provision meant that former slaves are indeed U.S. citizens. The second provision of the 14th Amendment requires that states protect all rights of U.S. citizens. States are expected to provide equal protection of the laws and due process of the law. This particular amendment is still often used by civil rights activists to defend against discrimination. So you see, the 14th Amendment grants citizenship to former slaves, and it requires states protect all citizens of the United States. So now former slaves are citizens, and now states must protect the rights of those citizens. The 15th Amendment was adopted in 1869. The text of this amendment is also very brief. The language of the amendment is very clear, very plain, making it known that race or color or previous servitude cannot deny U.S. citizens from voting. The second section adds that Congress has the power, if needed, to enforce this law through appropriate legislation. The 15th Amendment did little to limit the effects of the poll tax, the grandfather clause, or the literacy tests that were implemented in southern states after Reconstruction ended that limited blacks from the vote. It was not until the 1950s and 1960s that black codes were struck down by Supreme Court rulings and congressional legislation. An example of legislation that struck down discriminatory state policies is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, passed by the U.S. Congress. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are together known as the Reconstruction Amendments. They were intended to establish policy at the national level regarding the end of slavery and the process for ensuring the protection of rights for former slaves. Even with the power of these amendments, the black population of the United States did not experience true equality until almost 100 years later with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954.